Posada meeting. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tammy Dorr, and I serve as President and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership. We believe, as so many of you do, in the very famous words of Jane Jacobs, that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are built by everybody. That's a deep held value here at the Downtown Denver Partnership. We have a comprehensive plan and platform to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in our city, and it actually threads through all of our work, from mobility to housing to how we develop individuals through our leadership program. We have over 20 champions that help us drive inclusivity and help hold us accountable, as well as a deep commitment and proclamation by our board. So today, we are bringing everyone together, along with our partners from historic Denver, to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity as part of our speaker series. And so we thank you for joining us for this, and we hope that you'll be able to join the couple of others that we'll be having throughout the rest of the next 6 or 7 months. In the 20-year strategic plan, the downtown area plan, we call for the need to build a distinctive city. And in that message and in that mission, we talk about a mosaic of districts. Districts and neighborhoods are truly what make up the comprehensive psyche, culture, brand, and opportunities that exist in the city. So today, we're not only joined by historians, but by our fellow community members. We'll hear from each of our panelists on their respective neighborhoods. We'll discuss what's being done to connect our past to our present and, just as importantly, to our future. And we'll talk about how we can all play a part in ensuring distinct and vibrant neighborhoods. Better understanding how the decisions that we make today have this long arm that stretches far into the future. The partnership is committed to creating a place where we all feel a sense of belonging, a place where we can all live, we can all work, and we can all thrive. So our diversity and inclusion speaker series is a big part of that commitment and part of our deep understanding that to build a great city, we need engagement across cultures and among many diverse viewpoints. The speaker series, including the session you hear today, will give us the opportunity to learn from and engage with experts and with each other. So as we all work together to build a city for everyone, we invite you to join us to collaborate and co-create our future. We're proud to have collaborated with Historic Denver on this program, and you'll hear from them in just a moment. We're also incredibly grateful for the support of our title sponsor, the Harris Law Firm. The Harris Law Firm's dedication to diversity and inclusion spans well beyond this sponsorship and this support. It's ingrained in all of the work that they do. If you know this team, you know that it is a deep value in their personal and their family lives, as well as their professional lives. And this firm is deeply committed as well to making sure that they are a part of our civic fabric. On behalf of the partnership, I want to thank the Harris Law Firm for their deep commitment to the community and this important work. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Rich Harris, a person who I truly admire and value the collaboration and partnership to help build our city. President of the Harris Law Firm. Rich, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for that kind introduction. And we are so happy to.
Rich, I don't think we can hear you.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we can. You're good.
Am I good?
Good, Rich. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Tammy, for the kind introduction. We are so grateful to the Downtown Denver Partnership, and we're proud to be the sponsor for this important speaker series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We at the Harris Law Firm are a firm dedicated to family law. We've been around for 25 years plus, and we were founded on the notion of service and giving back. This is an important moment for the city of Denver that we're all so proud of. And these are such critically important discussions to move our city forward. We couldn't be more grateful to be a part of this important moment. So on behalf of myself and all the employees at the Harris Law Firm, we thank you for joining, and we look forward to this series. Today, it's my pleasure to kick the series off by a discussion about some of the important historic places in Denver, their cultural roots. For those of us like myself who aren't from here, this is really interesting and important stuff. It's part of the fabric of our city. All the different viewpoints and the different backgrounds of who we are as a culture is really what makes us great. So without further ado, I know you don't want to hear from me on and on. Let me introduce Annie Levinsky. Annie is the Executive Director of Historic Denver. Annie.
Thank you so much to both of you. We are so glad to be with you this morning, and we so appreciate this opportunity to partner with our longtime friends at the DDP. And so we're really again grateful for the invitation. For those of you who are not familiar with Historic Denver, we're a membership-driven nonprofit that serves as a resource and advocate for Denver's historic places. We were founded 50 years ago next month with our acquisition of the Molly Brown House, which we continue to own and operate. And in addition to the museum and our advocacy work, we have a significant technical assistance program and numerous education programs, including our popular walking tours, which usually run from May to October each year and highlight different neighborhoods in our city. And it's through this work that we've established relationships with many amazing Denverites with deep ties to our city's past. And so we're so glad that 3 of them could join us this morning and add their perspective on the history of downtown Denver's neighborhoods. And we really thank them all for their time. The agenda this morning will include the presentation by Dr. Nikki Gonzalez, who I'll introduce in a moment, and she'll provide an overview of downtown history, and that'll be followed by the panelist presentations. I do want to acknowledge our colleagues, Britt Deal and Allison Salutes, who helped coordinate this program and will be back later to help coordinate the question and answers. And due to the large size of the group, we encourage you to put your questions in the chat box so that they can sort through them and make sure we have time to answer as many as possible at the end of the program. We're really excited about this in large part because we too think it's really important to tell the full story of our city and to understand all the different experiences that have shaped our built environment and our lived experience. And so that understanding all of these different perspectives is critical to that. And it's something that our board has committed to as well as we work to ensure that the buildings and places that we care for reflect the full breadth of our city's story. So it's now my honor to introduce Dr. Nikki Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez is the Associate Professor of History and the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at Regis University. She's a native of Denver, and her family has deep roots in Southern Colorado and Northern New Mexico. She specializes in the history of the American West with a focus on race relations and social and political movements. And she also serves on the Historian Council for History Colorado. So Dr. Gonzalez will begin our program with a land acknowledgement in just a moment. As a place-based organization, we at Historic Denver spend a lot of time and energy researching and sharing the stories of place in our city, but we think these stories are incomplete if we don't acknowledge and consider the whole history of the place and some of its hard truths. So I will turn it over to Dr. Gonzalez.
Good morning, everybody. Wish I could see you all in person. But I want to first of all, thank the Harris Law Firm for their sponsorship of today's event and Historic Denver for inviting me and the panelists to share some history with you. And thank you to the Downtown Denver Partnership for conceiving of this project. I think this is really special. It's like the historian's moment. We're very happy to be here. So we'll begin, as Annie said, thank you for the introduction, Annie. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge with respect that the land we are discussing today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. This was also an important site of trade for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, and their descendants still reside here. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the historic and present ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. with that, I will begin the program by sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was asked to provide an overview of Denver's history, or specifically as much as I could, downtown Denver's history. And I thought for a group like this, it would be helpful to talk about themes, because we certainly in about 15 minutes, we can't cover a whole lot of ground, but just to kind of like divide this history into themes is pretty helpful. So the first theme is that Indigenous peoples have called this land home for generations, for centuries, and we have to acknowledge that. The second theme is the role of extractive industries in Denver's growth, beginning from its earliest days as a site of gold seekers, people coming, you know, prior to Denver's settlement. It was kind of this place of opportunity for people who were seeking gold. Post-Civil War, we have the arrival of homesteaders who relied on Denver for supplies and transportation. So this migration into the region in which Denver became a regional hub. And then in the 1860s and 70s, again, going back to that Indigenous history of the place, we see a clash of cultures occur, which results in a policy of extermination on the national level, which really plays out with some extreme consequences here in what would become Colorado. Official policy, like I said, was warfare and extermination of Indigenous peoples, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then another theme is the rise of Denver as a transportation, agriculture, and financial hub, and manufacturing as well. The dry climate would bring tuberculosis patients to the Denver area, and really Colorado Springs as well, along the Front Range. And this is where we see the founding of places like National Jewish Hospital. Immigration, okay, the immigration and migration, I should say. And our three panelists will share their stories, their family stories of some very diverse neighborhoods, ethnic and racial neighborhoods, where we'll see these stories of migration and immigration play out in some interesting ways. And we'll also see some common themes within those narratives as well. So with that, get on to the more exciting images. As I was saying, so, you know, Denver, the area that would become Denver was the traditional homeland of some Indigenous tribes. And this is an early depiction of kind of the beginning of the meeting, or the clash of those cultures began in 1859 at the site of the confluence of Cherry Creek and the Platte River here. And this is obviously an artist's depiction. And this is the year after Denver was first settled by white settlers coming west seeking gold. And you can see this is a depiction of Arapaho and the American settlers kind of joining together here. This early history is a little bit hard to pinpoint because there was so much migration, and the tribes that did call this their home were transitory peoples who often followed buffalo or were pushed westward as Euro-American settlers pushed westward as well. But it is notable that in 1851, the United States government signed a treaty with a group of indigenous tribes called the Fort Laramie Treaty, and had promised the land that is today Denver to the Arapaho tribe, okay? And if you do your math, it was about 7 years later that was essentially broken. So as I was saying, Denver was settled in 1858 and it was called Denver because of the Denver Town Company. And they named the city of Denver, the settlement of Denver, after then Kansas Governor James Denver, hoping to gain favor and hoping to convince him to make this part of the country part of the Kansas Territory. So there was some, I guess, agenda behind that. But Denver would grow into 2 separate towns and soon to be 3. So this is an early 1858 map of the Denver area, which shows actually 3 townships. There was Denver, right on the lower left-hand corner. It was on the east side of Cherry Creek, Auraria would develop on the west side of Cherry Creek, and then the northern bluffs to the right on the map, that would be the Highland area, the township of Highland, which is now the Highland neighborhood. And so this is just a very early portrait of Denver. Through the 1860s, Denver would continue to grow. The Colorado Territory was established in 1861. And by 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The last spike was hammered in Utah. And so with that, we see the West in general completely transformed now that we have a very efficient way for people to make their way west. And in 1870, this becomes very relevant for Denver because that is when Denver was linked to the Transcontinental Railroad. And that access to that transcontinental form of transportation was really key to Denver's growth. And so, like I was saying, if we go back to our themes, this is a time of the clash of cultures and a time when many white settlers were very hostile toward the indigenous tribes in this area. And so there was, the majority believed that there was no peaceful coexistence possible. This would be primarily under the direction of Governor John Evans. And in 1864, it would play out in very violent ways at Sand Creek in southern Colorado, which saw some of the worst violence, the Sand Creek Massacre, where about 200 women, children, and elderly Cheyenne and Arapaho were massacred by a Colorado regiment at the time of the Civil War as well. So we have that clash going on. We have the settlement of Denver going on. We have the economic development of the region as Denver, it becomes a hub of supplies for the mining regions in the area, becomes a transportation hub, a manufacturing hub, and also a hub supplying agricultural supplies for ranches and farms, especially on the Eastern Plains. So we see incredible growth. And here is actually a photograph, a historic photograph of what would become the Globeville, Elyria, and Swansea area, the Denver Union Stockyards, which was built in 1881. And so you can see the agricultural industry here in Denver is quite vibrant. Also in 1881, Union Station was built, which became the connector of those different rail lines and gave growth to what would become lower downtown. Okay. So here's a picture of Union Station in the 1890s. And you can see that there are no cars yet, so it's still horse and buggy. And this was following a fire in lower downtown that pretty much gutted Union Station. And we see increased growth. Then by 1920, Denver has grown out. And we also, if we were to look at the 19-teens in terms of historical trends, this is a time of immigration into Denver, and Gregorio El Caro will share his family's history of leaving the conditions of the Mexican Revolution in the 19-teens and coming north to Colorado and settling in West Denver. And so we start to see immigrant groups coming into the core of the city of Denver. Here's a very interesting map. Historians love maps. And this map shows us the areas of home ownership, single family home ownership in and around the Denver neighborhoods. And if you notice this, I mean, maps tell big stories. And this particular one shows a lot of growth in home ownership on the outskirts of Denver, the outer neighborhoods of Denver. Not so much in the core of Denver. And you can see some of the neighborhoods that we're going to be talking about today. You see the Five Points neighborhood, the Auraria neighborhood, and then Sakura Square somewhere in the inner city here. And what this tells us a lot of things. First of all, this is post-World War I. So there had been a larger migration to Denver from outer rural areas as well. But it also shows you people who have the means to buy homes are moving outside of the core of the city. And who's left? It is the more ethnic, racial neighborhoods that many of them don't own their homes. And there tends to be some decay in the inner city at this time as well. Now, if you know your Denver history, you know that the 1920s was a rather dark period. in the 1920s, it's estimated that about 5% of Colorado's population were actually members of the KKK. And this is the second KKK in our nation's history. So a little bit of national context. Post-Civil War, so 1860s, 1870s, we see the emergence of the first Ku Klux Klan. And that is an organization that was, founded to reinforce kind of those behavioral codes that existed prior to the Civil War. It was very anti-Black. It was the era of Jim Crow. Well, in the 19-teens, 1920s, we see the emergence of the second KKK, which was very big in the Midwest and in the West, surprisingly to a lot of people. And this was a Klan that was focused on 100% Americanism, which happened to be Woodrow Wilson's re-election motto in 1916. So there's a dark connection there. But this Klan was focused on anti-immigrant. They were very nativist. They were focused on Catholics and Jews, anyone who they considered outside of that definition of 100% Americanism. In Denver itself, downtown Denver was, if you were a member of the Klan, you were in the inner network and you could get far in politics and in business. And so this is Larimer Street in 1926, very open demonstration march by the Ku Klux Klan. So there's a darker history to this, and a lot of these ethnic and racial neighborhoods had to deal with this. I teach at Regis University, and being a Catholic university, they were also targets. And in 1922, a group of Klan members had planned this big show of force, and they were going to burn a cross on the Regis campus. And so the Regis students and the Jesuit priests, they lined up around the perimeter of the campus and repelled the Klan. So there are some very public, very scary moments of clashing. Next slide. Okay, so this is a map from 1938 in Denver. And I know you can't see a lot of the really detail in here, but again, some of the neighborhoods that we're going to be talking about today with our panelists are labeled red neighborhoods on this map. And this was a map that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1938, and it graded neighborhoods all over the country based on a scale of desirability, green being the absolute best, and banks would freely lend mortgage loans to people who were interested in buying in those areas. But there were restrictive covenants, and they were white neighborhoods. Blue were neighborhoods that were considered to be still desirable. Yellow were neighborhoods that were definitely declining, and red, some of the neighborhoods we're going to talk about today, were considered hazardous. And if you look closer at the historic record, you can see that the way that the creators of these maps described the neighborhoods really were based in really harmful stereotypes. And they talked about infiltration, like, these West Denver neighborhoods, they were being infiltrated by Mexicans, and, they were run down, and they were definitely not worth investment. And so that's another part of the history of Denver. And I think I'm okay on time so far. So going forward, this is, sorry to jump around, but this is Denver in 1953. And you can see, again, the spread. And if you look really closely at this, if you can blow it up on your computer screen, you can see that the military-industrial complex has arrived, and it will reshape the shape, the culture of the city during World War II and post-World War. And you can see Lowry Air Force Base, Buckley Air Force Base, and all of these different kind of military installations that bring people, bring opportunity, bring jobs, and bring changes to the Denver landscape. So I will take questions at the end, but I think I'm going to move on to an introduction of our panelists. So I hope that gives you a little bit of context for what our panelists will be talking about. Our first speaker will be Gregorio El Caro, and Gregorio is a Denver native. His family lived in Auraria, also known as the West Side, from the 19-teens, and they were the last family to be displaced from there in 1974 during a period of Denver's urban renewal. Walking with his mother in Auraria to meet families and business owners, Gregorio witnessed firsthand The community changes from 1964 to 1976. Gregorio later attended all institutions in Auraria, including the University of Colorado Denver Master's Program in Urban Design and Landscape Architecture, focusing on architectural programming and site analysis. He has worked with minority and disadvantaged communities, including the Navajo and Hopi tribes, on preservation of sacred sites and trails, and designed memorial spaces for former communities. An artist in residence, Gregorio has used art to teach children about ecology and Colorado history and has worked on numerous community preservations projects in Adams County, including working with neighborhoods who have experienced displacement to create large outdoor murals, theater, and has brought historic exhibits to Colorado. In 2007, Gregorio founded a community minority grassroots arts and humanities preservation and urban design organization called Auraria and Casamayan Heritage. In 2018, Gregorio received Historic Denver's Ann Love Award for non-traditional initiatives, creativity, and commitment in preserving Denver's cultural and architectural history. As a film director and storyboard artist, he is currently completing a television screenplay miniseries drama about the legendary Casamayan. Wow, can't wait to see it. In 2010, Gregorio's grandmother, Carolina Gonzalez, was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame for her humanitarian, cultural, and business work in Auraria, only the second Mexican-American in the historical category. Our second speaker is Gil Asakawa. Gil is a journalist, editor, author, and blogger who covers Japan, Japanese American, and Asian American Pacific Islander culture and social justice issues. He is a nationally known speaker, panelist, and expert on Japanese American history and Asian American identity. He's the author of Being Japanese American, A History of Japanese in America, originally published in 2004 and revised in 2014. His journalism experience runs the gamut from being the musical editor and investigative reporter for Denver's alternative weekly newspaper, Westword, and the entertainment editor for the Colorado Springs Gazette daily newspaper, to managing denverpost.com website. He is well known to his followers for posting photographs of food on social media. He has written for national publications, including Rolling Stone magazine, and has been published in Newsweek Japan. From 2010 to 2020, Asakawa was student newspaper advisor in the journalism department at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He's also a consultant for AARP's Asian American marketing team, managing its social media and writing articles about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. In 2019, he served as a consultant with the Colorado Media Project, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion for the organization's statewide projects. Our third speaker is Terry Gentry. Terry is a third-generation native of Denver. She is married to Dwight Gentry with 4 children and 8 grandchildren. She attended Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design in interior design. She has a bachelor's degree in African and African American Studies from Metro State College, now University of Denver, and a master's degree in humanities with a focus in public history and museum studies from the University of Colorado, Denver. Terry is an interior designer and business owner of A Terrific Design, LLC, and a sales manager at Joy's Consigned Furnishings in Denver. She is a member of the Aurora, Colorado chapter of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. She is a volunteer docent and on the board of directors at the Black American West Museum and Heritage Center. She conducts museum tours, 5 Points walking tour, and facilitates presentations about Black Americans in the West and other topics to schools, community groups, government agencies, and businesses throughout the Denver metro area and the Front Range communities. So wow, I'm honored to present our 3 panelists to you. You're really in for a treat. These are 3 very accomplished creative individuals, and I'm delighted to have had this chance to work with them. And they will share with you the power of their family story. So I'll turn it over to Gregorio now. Thank you. Gregorio?
Okay, welcome. Well, thank you. I want to thank, am I on? Can you hear me, everyone? Oh,
Yep, you're good.
all right, thank you. First of all, thank you for the sponsors, Harris Law Firm, Historic Denver, and to host such an important discussion. This is a very critical time. It's very relevant, and I'm happy to show how Auraria plays an important part in understanding diversity and inclusion and equity. I'd like to acknowledge the 160th anniversary of the emergence of Auraria town to Denver, the two different communities that struggled to decide who was going to be the commerce center of our region, continue to have a distinct characteristics between the two that lasted for over 100 years and are still being addressed today because of the borders of Cherry Creek and Colfax and the Platte River. And I will begin, well, I also would like to acknowledge that the Downtown Denver Partnership, their early beginnings with forming the Downtown Denver Incorporated is 65 years, 1955. I will be focusing on my family as an example of just one of millions of Mexican Americans who migrated north from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution of 1910. But I would like to mention that the Mexican Americans, I'm using that term, Auraria had Hispanics, people from Puerto Rico, Cuba, those that were born in the region of Colorado, and so I'm using that term just to simplify that the majority of those people that settled in, lived in Auraria were Mexican Americans, and that includes the term Chicano and Latino. So I will would like to give an overall view of Auraria, the characteristics that separated it from Denver, and how these architectural differences compared to Denver, the layout, the uses of our community allowed for the working class and immigrants from all over the world to flourish and preserve their culture. And the distinctions were very significant. Compared to Denver, the Auraria was always, besides introducing our first institutions in commerce and newspapers, banking, and light industries, and so forth, it was a community that had many churches, many schools, educational institutions. We had light industries. We had residencies, and these were all integrated. We didn't have the zoning that separated light industries from religious institutions and schools and residency. And this turned out to be very successful. Although not planned, it turned to be very successful in allowing our community to express itself, preserve our culture. And I'm also, by the way, including the other ethnic groups. It was a community that was born somewhat instantly in terms of its ethnic background. When people came here during the discovery of gold, Auraria was somewhat of an instant city. It didn't have time to have different ethnic groups, minority groups, segregate themselves into neighborhoods. So up until the displacement of Auraria, you had various ethnic groups live in the same block. At 9th Street example, 9th Street Historic Park, for instance, or 9th Street, is an example where those immigrants that were Jewish, Irish, English, Scottish, Cuban, German, Mexican, all lived in the same block. And that is very distinct. And if I were to pick a thread, I'm going to list some of the characteristics because this puts into context how racial tolerance and diversity were preserved in our community. You can say that beginning in the 1850s up until the 1970s, that our community could be described as humanitarian. Non-government humanitarian services were provided by our community. in addition to the light industries, we had a lot of food production, a diversity of food production, but we had a system of bartering. And so with the people who made wrought iron or cast iron or printing, they would barter with each other. So they provided services outside of Denver and within Denver. And that sustained us. And I'm going to jump into my family. I'm already realize how time is flying by here. My family came from Mexico. This is an example of the journey they took from Chihuahua City, El Paso. My grandmother, pictured there on the right, was a nurse. She took care of soldiers and wounded during the revolution. My grandfather was an architect. Their family, their extended family, traveled north. They arrived in Auraria in 1918. But during that period, they had to learn how to deal with people from various backgrounds and also barter and develop.
Gregorio?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We don't have your screen share, so we actually don't see the photo of the map or your grandmother.
Okay. Let's see here.
Gregorio, do you see the share screen icon at the bottom?
Let's see here.
It's green.
That's right. All right. Excuse me.
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay. This is my grandmother, and I'm showing right now the journey that many took to arrive in Denver from Mexico, over 1 million. And they settled in Auraria for various reasons, partly because the train station was located closely. I'm giving a here's a view of Denver from Auraria. We had again mixed uses. Light industry was integrated with religious institutions and residencies and small businesses here. And this is a photograph of Auraria shortly before the demolition. We had a 36 square blocks. Most of the buildings, landmarks that we were well made in the Victorian period were destroyed, except for 9th Street, which is on the bottom right. We had also a farmer's market bordering Cherry Creek, an organic local farmer's market for half a century. People were able to work, worship, be educated, and live within a small radius. In fact, within a 2-block radius, you had 8 churches, 5 schools. And we were a pedestrian-oriented community that did not need cars. This is my grandmother. I will jump into the role of the role of Auraria. The Tivoli, or I should say almost 1/4 of Mexican Americans would congregate into the Auraria neighborhood during the September 16th celebrations. This was a very important holiday of independence. And it was only one of the few places where the Mexican people were allowed to congregate. St. Cajetan's was very important. This architecture not only reflected our culture, but our first masses and churches were built by Hispanic people in our region. We had 700 people attend these institutions. And it's important to know that in preserving our culture, a lot of the religious ceremonies involved processionals. And here's an example, 9th Street, the sidewalks and the easements in the streets were always a source of daily reminders of the cycles of life, those that were being born, baptized, married, and the deaths. So we always had that constant reminder of the cycles of life. We had porches in our homes that were always allowing us to interact with our community on a daily basis. This is a 500-year-old tradition called Las Posadas during Christmas, 9 days. Again, the architecture played an important part in preserving the Mexican-American culture. People opened their homes for 9 days, sharing food. This is the house my grandmother purchased, called the Smedley House at the time, built by a Quaker dentist. And what was important is my grandmother purchased this home. My grandfather got ill. In 1933, the significant time of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment, women could not get loans. Mexican women that was unspeakable, but she purchased this house in 1933. And what is important to know is how the homes were allowed to grow and expand. We had 30 people live here. It was a multi-generational community. Our community was also very musical. We shared musical traditions with both Irish, Jewish, German, and Mexican. This is just an example. This house is Denver's oldest house, built in 1872. When my grandmother and my grandparents arrived in Auraria, the first thing, and they purchased the house, they brought a tradition called mutual aid societies, mutualistas in Mexico. You came with the tradition of sharing your space, your home, to those people in need. Mutual aid societies allowed Mexicans to adapt to a new country, to learn businesses, to find a connection. Casa Mayan, which was named by my grandmother, became a mutual aid society house with no government assistance. It started a Red Cross sewing school during the Great Depression. It was the gathering place for information for those that didn't have newspapers or radios or TVs, to know what was going on in Mexico. And this is where you would come together. And later on, it became an internet of its day, because not only Mexican Americans, but people of all backgrounds came to learn about Mexican culture, desire to be bicultural. So we had Red Cross. During the Great Depression, we had over 250,000 estimated youths ride the rails that were homeless, boys looking for work. These are photographs. We lived near the railroad, so many of them knocked at the door for food, and my grandparents would never turn anyone down in exchange for work. This is the bottom. You can see the hobo language. It was told you which house to go to. And the Mexican tradition of my house is your house tested my grandparents' hospitality to the limit. And these boys were the first to experience Mexican culture, Mexican food. So besides being a humanitarian center, it was also a cultural center with music, musicians. My aunts and uncles got scholarships in the opera, started their own orchestras in Auraria. We were very musical. My grandfather, being a master chess player and an architect, would have gatherings and tournaments there up until World War II, where a lot of the generals would come and challenge him. So it was a rich culture. My family started after the war, a restaurant, Denver's first Mexican restaurant, introducing Mexican foods. It was a challenge at that time for non-Hispanics to allow foods that are very common today. And they had to work with the Japanese community to grow beans and chilies and corns that a lot of the non-Hispanic farmers couldn't grow. This became the cultural hub of Denver and Auraria. It was known for its people of all ethnic backgrounds, the rich and the poor, could come together and learn Mexican culture, bring their cultures in. And it was, someone later said, it was really a great example of what America was and what it could be, because it bridged those social, cultural, and economic barriers at a time of great racism. This is Kasamayan entrance. To show you.
Gregorio, you have about a minute left.
Okay, this is President Truman coming in 1948 for a dinner. What I wanted to end with, this is a proposed highway, that would have eliminated our community too, but is that 50 years later, we are proposing that this block is instilled again with the spirit of culture. And we are proposing, my family and other Rarians, to bring the house back as a public museum and a cultural center again to learn about the history of Mexican Americans. This is Kasamayan as it is today. And we're in the process of having to do a lot of renovation and raise funds to turn it in once again into a gathering place to learn about other cultures.
Thank you, Gregorio. That was wonderful. And now we have Mr. Gil Asakawa.
Hi, thanks for having me as one of the panelists. I wish we had more time than just 15 minutes, but I'll give it a shot. Now, can you see and hear me or just see me? Oh, Gregorio, I think you're still sharing your screen.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Okay, so I am Japanese American. My family moved here in 1973, 1972 actually, right when Sakura Square was built. But obviously the Japanese American community has a long history before that. I am going to go back in time and start with okay. You know, the thing about Zoom is that it gets all these navigational pieces that cover up other some of the things that I need to get to. Here we go. Slideshow from beginning. Duh. All right. So I'm going to talk about the Chinese community first. The Chinese arrived in the United States in 1849, you know, the San Francisco 49ers, because of the gold rush. But then when they were discriminated against and were not allowed to own rights to own their own gold mines, and could only work in certain fields like laundromats. There's no history in China of running laundromats or doing laundry. Doing laundry was just one of the few things that the Chinese were allowed to do, along with working on the railroad. So they were very instrumental in building the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, which, as Nikki said, was completed in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah, when the east and western railroads came together. The Chinese were not allowed, all the thousands of workers who helped build that were not allowed to attend the ceremony that celebrated the completion. But in 1870, when Nikki noted that Denver was connected to the Transcontinental Railroad, which ran across the north through Wyoming, in 1870, the first of those Chinese laborers arrived in Denver. And so in 1870, that census, there were 2 Chinese in Denver, probably a lot more because they weren't counted, or there were multiple, you know, generations, or multiple, not generations, with lots of people living in one address. And then by 1880, there was 500 or more, 500 officially, and they settled in the area right outside of Union Station. It was kind of a Chinatown district, which is today Lower Downtown or Lodo. and it was a thriving, by 1880, it was a thriving business district. It had some, some reputation for opium and whatnot. And so it was, racists were calling it Hop Alley as a derogatory term, but it was a Chinatown, like in San Francisco or other cities. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed, the first and only legislation in the United States that names one people from one nation to ban them from immigration into the US. And that one of the things that led to that was a race riot on October 31st, 1880, 2 years before the Exclusion Act in lower downtown Denver. A fight started in a saloon and between two Chinese men and a group of white men. And that fight turned into a race riot where thousands of people rampaged through the lower downtown district, destroying property, burning buildings. One man was beaten to death and then hung, a Chinese man was beaten to death and then hung from a lamppost. And this plaque here, which unfortunately focuses on the racist term Hop Alley, and then the last part of it is really about the white people in the area who protected and brought in the Chinese who were fleeing, which was a very important and good thing. But that is what's left to commemorate the original Chinatown district. And this horrible race riot on Halloween night, 1880, although Halloween wasn't a thing back then in 1880, has led to now, this week, I drafted the text for this, and the mayor signed a proclamation for Chinatown, naming October 31st, this Saturday, as a historic Chinatown Commemoration Day, and Chinatown's Commemoration Day. I think that's really important because it reminds people that this happened. This proclamation covers the race riot. It covers the vital community that was Chinatown. It does not focus on Hop Alley or some of the racial stereotypes. And this is a part of an effort by the Denver Asian American Pacific Islander Commission, and I'm one of the commissioners, to try to rebrand this history and to remind people that there was a Chinatown and that the area was and still is kind of a vibrant Asian district because after the Chinese were excluded, the Chinese came back by 1900. There were more than 1,000 Chinese in the area. Businesses were back. Not a single person or business was reimbursed for any damages, and nobody was jailed or convicted of the murder of the young man. But the Chinese did come back. But what's the weird thing about immigration patterns is that over the years, because of the Exclusion Act, the Chinese community got thinner and thinner. A lot of Chinese went back to China. And although we do have a lot of Chinese in the Denver area, they're second or third in number of Asian population in the most recent census. But they're almost all recent immigrants from China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam even. So the Chinese community is still here, but changed. Now, one of the things that happened because the Chinese were essentially prevented from, really taking root at the time was that in 1885, Japanese were encouraged to emigrate from Japan, which was suffering a famine, and come to the United States and be cheap labor, because that's what the US is always looking for is the next wave of cheap labor. And there's a picture of pre-war Larimer Street, the Colorado. I'm actually not sure what company that is, but you know, people waving American flags but wearing kimonos. And then this is a picture on the right of my wife's family after the war. Her entire family on both sides, grandparents, parents and great grandparents were incarcerated in concentration camps during World War II. But they came to Denver afterwards. Governor Ralph Carr, who was the governor at the beginning of the war, invited Japanese to come to Colorado, and he blew his political career by doing that because there's so much racial hatred. But he thought it was unconstitutional to lock up Japanese Americans just because of their ethnicity. And so after the war, a lot of Japanese from all the different camps, including Amachi in southeast Colorado, settled in Denver. And there was a period between the end of the war and well into the 60s and 70s where there were lots of Japanese and Japanese American owned businesses. This is one stretch along Larimer into, you know, from like 20th Street into what we call Rhino today. Hotels, laundromats, you know, dry cleaners, camera, photographer. This is a company that made mochi, which is a Japanese pastry. And so there was a vibrant community. This is never called Japantown, but at the western end of it was the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, which is still there. It was established in 1947 in its current location. Before that, it was closer to Coors Field, actually. And it celebrated its 100th anniversary, 100th birthday about 5 years ago. And the Sakura Square was the hub, that area, that block, was the hub of the community, even as the businesses stretched out over Larimer, all the way out to 29th. You know, there were auto shops and pharmacies. Excuse me. City Park and Five Points were, you know, a lot of this we'll cover in a bit, but it's because of redlining, those red districts on those maps. Immigrant communities of color, were pretty much forced to live in those communities. And so Japanese found themselves during the post-war years and pre-war years in the Five Points area alongside the African-American community. And if you look at the Manual High School Thunderbolt yearbooks from the early 50s, it's amazing. About a third of the faces are Japanese. And this is a Nisei Appreciation Club at Manual High School. Nisei is second generation Japanese Americans. So it's actually kind of amazing to think that 7 years after the end of the war, that these Japanese American kids could band together in a club and celebrate their community in 5 Points. Now, when you look through that yearbook, you see you know, African Americans and Japanese, lots of Caucasians, and everybody's just mixed together. Your typical yearbook. This is one of my wife's aunties. This is Helen Okubo, is the aunt of Derek Okubo, who is the executive director of Denver's agency for not civil rights, but it's community partnerships. And he's in charge of all the commissions, like the Asian American Commission. And he's in Mayor Hancock's cabinet. And this is his auntie, who attended Manual High School. If you talk to Japanese Americans who were born and raised in Colorado or lived here in the post-war years, chances are very good that they went to Cole Junior High and Manual High School. Now today, they are still celebrating culture and community in the Sakura Square area. This is a picture on the upper left of a Boy Scout troop welcoming a Miss Japanese American from Los Angeles. In the middle is my wife as a child with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother at the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, and family members in the upper right. Denver Taiko still performs this great drum group every year at the Cherry Blossom Festival, and then at the street dance on the lower right that used to be held in the street on Lawrence, but is now in the parking lot between the temple and Pacific Mercantile, the Japanese supermarket. Now, Sakura Square is in a 3-year process now, maybe longer, of redevelopment. They will intend to remain Japanese inspired and be a destination for anybody interested in Japanese American culture and food, and have businesses, probably a hotel. It's going to be a great redevelopment, and it could easily become a hub for a revival of Asian community interests in the lower downtown area. That would be my hope and vision for making that happen. Now, unfortunately, although Japanese Americans, Asian Americans are really, I mean, I could do a whole thing on presentation on Asian Americans and the Koreans and Vietnamese and the Filipinos, all of whom are represented in Denver, but deja vu all over again. This is the year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of, unfortunately, leadership using terms like Kung flu and China virus and turning this terrible disease into a racial political jackhammer, really. There's been a real spike in anti-Asian harassment and hate crimes this year. And our group has been, and other community groups have been working with law enforcement agencies in the area to get Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, to report anything that they see, record things. And it's hard because in many ways, things haven't changed from that day in 1880 when a fight broke out and there was already a lot of hatred against Chinese, and a fight broke out that led to a race riot. And I'm afraid that the potential for that still exists here. But lower downtown Denver, I mean, I've worked in this area for most of my career off and on, from Westward and the Denver Post and other jobs, AOL by Coors Field. And I love downtown Denver. I love the area that the partnership represents. I love lower downtown Denver. And I think there's still so much hope to have culture and vibrant ethnic communities in this area. So thank you very much for your time. Let me unshare. There we go.
Thank you, Gil. That was wonderful. And now our third panelist is Ms. Terry Gentry. Terry, you're on. And Gil, if you could stop sharing your screen, please.
I did. I thought I did.
Oh, yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I'll get my screen up and so I'm Terry Gentry. I am a volunteer docent at the Black American West Museum and Heritage Center in Northeast Denver in the Five Points neighborhood. And the museum was founded by Paul Stewart in 1971. So we're going to celebrate our 50th anniversary of the museum founding next year. And the the museum is in the former home of Dr. Justina Ford, who was our first Black woman licensed doctor in Colorado. And she lived at 2335 Arapahoe Street, and the house was moved to 3091 California Street in 1984, and then the museum was located in that space in 1988. So talking about our history of Denver, the Five Points Whittier neighborhoods is where we focus a lot of our presentations and things, but Black folks lived all over, such as Harmon, Colorado, and over in the Barnum neighborhood, we had a few Black families, and just scattered all over what's now the metro area, but the highest concentration of African Americans was in the Five Points and Whittier neighborhood. They started in the Five Points neighborhood and pushed the boundary of Downing Street to move east into the Whittier neighborhood in spite of a lot of de jure policies in place not to allow us to move east of Downing Street. We had a high concentration of African Americans in the Five Points neighborhood after the neighborhood was developed because of the railroads, and a lot of our Black men were porters and waiters on the railroads. And so the proximity to the railroads, this was a good location for them to move their families. And as we continue to have an increase in the population, we continue to move east of Downing Street into the Whittier neighborhood. They've always been multi-ethnic neighborhoods, and Whittier neighborhood probably reached maybe 60 to 75% African American from the 1920s to the 1960s. The Five Points neighborhood reached up to about a little over 50% African American from the 1920s through the 1960s. And so for me, this area, the Five Points Whittier neighborhood, is home base, and I had a lot of family live in the neighborhood, but the community is my family, just a lot of the folks that are here and the things that we had going on in that community. So for example, Zion Baptist Church and Shorter AME Church are the two oldest Black churches in Colorado. And one was organized in 1865 and the other in 1868. And my great-grandfather was a member of Zion Baptist Church. And then my great-great-grandparents on my mom's side, my great-great-grandfather was founder of one of the board of trustees for Scots United Methodist Church. And then later on, they joined Shorter AME Church. So I feel like I have really deep roots in both churches. These are some of the folks that came into Colorado for various reasons, and especially as Denver was in forming, some of these folks arrived and were active participants in civil rights actions and things happening here. For example, when Colorado applied for statehood in 1864, there were 137 men that signed a petition demanding the right to vote become part of Colorado's constitution for Black men to vote. And they sent that petition to Congress while they were evaluating whether or not to grant statehood. They also evaluated the petition, but Colorado was denied statehood because of their population, from what I understand. And then the state was granted, or statehood was granted in 1876. We also have someone such as Anclara Brown, who arrived in Denver in 1859, and she was formerly enslaved in Virginia. Her slaveholder sold her to Mr. Brown in Kentucky. And then when Mr. Brown passed away, she gained her freedom. Her other family members, including her husband, had been sold into slavery in other parts of the South. And after, so she was alone, and she went to St. Louis, worked as a laundress and cook on a wagon train to come to Colorado, arrived here in 1859. When slavery ended, she went back to the South to locate her family, couldn't find anyone, and found out her oldest daughter had passed away, brought back about 37 people to Colorado to help them get established. So her nickname is Angel of the Rockies. And then Julia Greeley was classified as Angel of Mercy, and she is currently they're trying to canonize her as a saint because of a woman having her in a dream after she passed away to tell her that she was going to have a child after they had tried for several years to have a child. And we also have Edward Sanderlin and William Jefferson Hardin and Frederick Douglass's sons. Frederick Jr. and Lewis Douglass had a mortuary here in the Five Points neighborhood. We also have our first Black attorney, and he was also the founder, started the Colorado Statesman newspaper. His wife, Emma Azalea Hackley, was the first Black woman to graduate from University of Denver with a degree in music. And then women's suffrage, Elizabeth Piper Inslee and Ida DePriest were part of the women's suffrage movement as well. Colorado granted women the right to vote in 1893. So we were the second state to grant women the right to vote, long before the 19th Amendment in 1920. Although we continue to have some struggles with the Black community having the right to vote. So but that's a whole nother presentation. Dr. Justina Ford, the first Black woman licensed physician in Colorado, attended the delivery of more than 7,000 babies, more than 37 different nationalities, and knew in the range of 8 to 11 languages and dialects. And the museum is in her former home. This is the Cousins family who purchased a lot of properties in the Five Points neighborhood, and granddaughter Renee Cousins King still owns property in the neighborhood, makes sure that folks have resources and places to live. Madam C.J. Walker was the first woman millionaire in the country. She started her business here in Colorado, in Denver. We had a Negro baseball team. Dr. Joseph H.P. Westbrook and Dr. Thomas Ernest McLean. Dr. McLean is my great-grandfather. He's the first Black licensed dentist in Colorado. And Dr. Westbrook is his best friend. They both attended Meharry Medical School. And Dr. Westbrook infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan here in Denver in the 1920s. And the Boule protected his identity and made sure that he was safe. And this is Dr. Clarence Holmes, who was also part of the Boule. He was a dentist and very active in a lot of different organizations and a civil rights activist. Of jazz and Five Points history, George Morrison, Charles Burrell, Marion Morrison Robinson, Hattie McDaniel, Mr. Burrell's cousin, Purnell Steen, and niece are still part of this jazz scene in Denver, even though we don't have a prolific jazz scene, but we've got a few restaurants and things that still celebrate that history. And these are some of the other important members of that community as well. Leroy Smith with music, Bill Parker Robinson, the Pullman Porters, who I'd mentioned earlier, with setting up home in the Five Points and Whittier neighborhoods. This is Whittier Elementary School, and Marie Greenwood was the first Black tenured teacher at Whittier. We lost her a year ago, just a week shy of her 107th birthday. This is Mr. Ward, who was the coolest principal at Manual High School and made quite an impact on our community. The African-American firefighters and their history, they were segregated, but they still served their community and anyone that needed service. We were redlined, so we had internal services with Colored American Loan and Realty, McKinley Harris, Dave and Vivian Smith, Dave Smith Realty. This is my mom's family on the left. It's 5 generations from my uncles, my grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother seated, and my great-great-great-grandmother standing on the right. My great-great-great-grandmother was just shy of her 90th birthday. In this picture, she lived to almost 103 years old. And the picture on the right is my great-great-great-aunt Neil. She's my great-great-grandmother's sister. And then that's my grandmother, that's my dad's mom. And then my great-grandmother and my grandmother, my mom's side. And they're all part of this Five Points Whittier neighborhood. These are business owners in the community as well. And Fire Chief Rod Janelle, his family goes back generations. Sonny Lawson, There's Norm Harris and Brother Jeff. Jessie Whaley Maxwell, first Black woman first Black woman principal. The Tuskegee Airmen, they're a big part. A lot of them are Manual High School graduates. Colonel Hubert L. Hooks Jones and John Mosley, Dave Smith, Omar Blair, they're Tuskegee Airmen, but Colonel Jones and John Mosley and Dave Smith were also Manual High School graduates. And the American Woodmen, these are some of the businesses in the neighborhood. These are families and stories, history of the neighborhood. Bernice McLeod, who documented our community for 50 years. The Ford Warren Library. These are some of the Manual High School graduates, and I got to celebrate my dad, Division Chief C.T. Smith, retired from the Denver Police Department. And the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library, named for Omar D. Blair and Elvin Caldwell, who was our first Black city council member. Omar Blair is our first Black president of the Denver School Board. And Pauline Robinson is our first Black woman librarian. I got through that quickly. This is just a drop in the bucket and just a little piece of my history, but all of these people I consider my extended family. I grew up with knowing most of the people in this century as extended family, being part of my grandparents' lives and my parents' lives. And so I'd be happy to talk to you more about that in greater detail and show PowerPoint presentations that last an hour long if you're interested in any more. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you to all of our panelists. Those were amazing stories. We have a couple of questions that have come in, and so I'll just pose them for the group. But first of all, I want to acknowledge Denver Public Library for your wonderful map collection, and that was part of my presentation, and I think some of the other presentations as well. So again, Denver Public Library, thank you for being such a great curator of our history. One of the big questions that came in was about the displacement of Mexican-American families from the what is now the Auraria campus, the Auraria neighborhood. And Gregorio, I know you probably weren't able to get to this part in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you would be able to touch on that and your family's history with that displacement.
Oh, thank you. Yes, very briefly, as Dr. Gonzalez had mentioned about redlining, Auraria, the displacement was probably 15 years in the making. And it was a national movement. There was a national movement to replace blighted neighborhoods. And this coincided with a movement with the national highways and housing, need for housing. In the case of Auraria, there was a third coincidence or confluence, and that was the need for or desire for higher education centers. There were 19 sites selected in the 1967 to determine through the Colorado Board of Commissions, Education Commissions, which would be a good site. We had, as a community, survived that displacement or potential displacement in 1964. But because of the flood of 65, when a lot of the light industries were damaged, it propelled that desire for a college campus. This was a public vote. It was a bond issue. The Denver would receive, in today's terms, about $86 million of matching funds to build the center. There was no talk about displacement. This was put to the vote this anniversary of November 4th, 1969, for funding. And so there was, unfortunately, only with our community being isolated politically, because we were a self-sustaining community, we lost that vote. And what is sad is that there was opportunities to keep the culture, the businesses, the schools, the religious institutions, and integrate the college into our community. And I may say that it was those architects and planners that actually engaged with the Mexican Americans, like at Casamayan. Casamayan was a great hangout for architects and planners, that they realized there was other options beside totally eradicating and destroying the buildings and the culture. And the vision it could have been was that we would have had a school mixed in with a traditional or Mexican American community. But that took place on November 4th, 1969. My grandparents' restaurant, Cultural Center, had its last meal this week, anniversary, Halloween in 1973. And we had 350 families and 250 businesses that were displaced. And I believe all those businesses have never recovered. There's only, I think, maybe one out of those that have maintained. These were family-owned businesses too. So, but it's an important topic, especially for downtown Denver, to understand the role of urban planning, architecture, and culture. The planners did not have an understanding or criteria of how to evaluate cultural benefits or needs or expressions of a community. It was very limited to the price of the building versus the interaction of the community. That was wonderful. It was a very close-knit community, and we had a major loss by having such a large minority community in downtown Denver removed. But it's a very complex history that goes back. If I may sum it up, there was a value system in separating lifestyles or uses. Light industry, religious institutions, residencies, schools were not to be integrated into the visions of some of these planners that were post-war thinkers of how they envisioned the future.
Thanks, Gregorio, for that answer. We have another question here that any of the panelists, you're welcome to answer. How can we best use these history lessons to honor the cultures and ensure vibrancy in our neighborhoods? So who would like to take a shot at that one?
I'll take a shot. I think having official commemorations, maybe some more visible signage or markers, or, Larimer Square is a great role model. What Dana Crawford started in the 1960s is today accepted as kind of a destination in Denver as a historic block. But they have all these signs and things over the street, and you can put bricks and markers in the pavement. I think there are lots of things that can be done to let people know about the history of our communities, and then long-term things, or because we have such an emphasis on public art. How about some murals that celebrate the ethnic history? I would offer a suggestion that the wall on the building by Coors Field, where the plaque for the anti-Chinese race riot is, that wall would make a great mural for celebrating the Asian American history in the city. So those kinds of really public displays, I think, would be really helpful, or annual celebrations, Lunar New Year things maybe in the area, so on and so forth.
Great suggestions, Gil. Terry or Gregorio, would you like to take a shot at that one?
Well, with regards to Auraria, I'm working with professors on campus representing history, architecture, Chicano studies, anthropology. We're proposing to come back in. We were pushed out, and the idea that campus has 50,000 students, and the majority of them do not have an understanding, given that they have degrees in history and preservation and anthropology and architecture, are not aware of the rich heritage that we have. So I'm working to propose that we actually reactivate the 9th Street Historic Park, which was preserved of one of 36 blocks, and for 50 years 45 years have been used for offices, actually bring that back to the public for a heritage park that celebrates the culture and the history and engages the students with former Aurarians. So that's the plan of Auraria, and eventually have a museum and be inspired with the great work that Terry has and the Black History Museum, and perhaps support these small house museums. My grandmother's house will be 150 years old in 2022. And we hope that that will be the date to have another house museum.
Thanks, Gregorio. Terry, did you want to answer that one too?
Yes, thank you. I am concerned about how much transformation has occurred in the rapid pace, and feel like sometimes, unfortunately, the voice of the neighborhood is not considered when developers are coming in. I'm witnessing what's happened along Welton Street in the last few years. Is just devastating for me. So I think it would be really, really important to have more community engagement and make sure that the voices of the people are heard. There's so many people in the 5 Points and Whittier neighborhoods that have been pushed out because they can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
The taxes have pushed them out if you're an old person and you retired, and then the taxes, because the property values have gone up so much. I've talked to several people where their property values have gone up so much that the tax base went up through the roof and exceeds their retirement money. They get pushed out and they got to sell the house and go find a little place to live, and they can't even live in Denver anymore because they can't afford the housing at all. And so watching and witnessing that is very, very painful. So we've got to figure out something to continue to keep folks in place and to keep the infrastructure from so rapidly changing and destroying that history. And I'll stop there. I could just ramble on and on about that, but that's really, really critical and very painful to witness.
Indeed it is. Thank you, Terry. We have a couple of minutes, and this is a meaty question here, but I'll ask it anyway. With Governor Evans' influence and efforts to connect Denver to the world via the railroad, as well as with his founding of the University of Denver, how do we today reconcile that positive history with his uglier connections to creating the atmosphere that led to the Sand Creek Massacre? That's a great question. You know, how do we reconcile a person's good and bad sides, right? That's very much in the public debate right now. So who would like to take a stab at that one?
I'll mention that there's a documentary coming out this fall called, what is it called? I interviewed the director who's Black and Asian American, and it's about the taking down of Confederate monuments, primarily in New Orleans. But because of Black Lives Matter, there's so much awareness now of how our history that we've been taught has, one, been really managed and fed to us, and two, that it overlooks a lot of horrible things that a lot of our leaders have done. You know, I think it is a complicated question. I am all for, you know, I don't want to see the Confederate flag because it symbolizes something for me that makes me clench my gut. I don't think that all our leaders have been perfect, and that they all have dark sides, probably all of them. You know, when I first found out that John F. Kennedy was not exactly a great guy, I was just devastated because I wrote reports on him when I was in 3rd and 4th grade. So, you know, do we do we change? I thought of this earlier during your presentation, Nikki. Do we change the name of Mount Evans? Will that change things? I guess I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know what the answer is. I know that I totally support Black Lives Matter. I think this conversation and these protests that we're going through right now are super, super important. And we do have to face our racist history and white privilege and all of those terms, which has now been banned from federal government trainings. But I am a little bit confused, I guess, about what the solution is with specific instances and people. Do we just kind of make sure that we educate people about the connection between Evans and the Sand Creek Massacre? I still don't think a lot of people know about the Sand Creek Massacre. So I think maybe education is the #1 thing. Sorry to take so much time.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Gil. And with that, I'm afraid that we're out of time.
Oh.
But I'm delighted to have been part of this panel and to talk about history. This is great that there's so much interest, and thank you very much to the Downtown Denver Partnership. So I'll turn it back over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, and thank you to our panelists, Terry Gentry, Gregorio El Caro, and Gil Asakawa. I also really want to extend a great thank you to Annie and Allison at Historic Denver and to our title sponsor, the Harris Law Firm. Thanks to everyone on the call for taking time to be here, because it sends a message that you care about this history. You want to understand not just what has happened, but how we take what has happened to learn about how decisions, choices, engagement, giving voice inform what we do in the future. I know I learned a lot today, and I no doubt believe that many of you on the call did as well. I do want to add that today was really designed to provide some snapshots of some of our neighborhoods. Please know that in no way do we ever believe that in 90 minutes we could even begin to address one of these areas or the depth of all of the decisions and evolution that have happened in these areas. So please know it's designed to open up the door, start some dialogue, get people thinking, and to begin to get a shared language around this history. So when we are talking about development or policy, that we have the past to help inform our future. This is just the start of our series. As I mentioned when we kicked off, I hope that you'll join us in November and December for 2 smaller format discussions. And then on February 24th, we'll be welcoming Tamika Butler. She's an internationally renowned urbanist. Her expertise lies in development with equity. We've brought her to Denver before. We're excited to bring her back. And just a big thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here, prepare, and present. Onward, please take what you learned, carry it with you in the spirit of building an inclusive city. Thank you, everyone.